Silent Hill 2 Remake. Let's talk about it. So the original Silent Hill 2 is one of the most revered video games of all time. No matter who you are, where you are, when you started playing games, what age you are, if you clicked on this video and you're involved in the video game ecosystem in the same way I am positive you've at least heard someone talk about Silent Hill 2 at some point. I remember my first time hearing about it was back in the day when I was young, maybe 12, 13, listening to the Kinda Funny podcasts way back in the Game Over Greggy show and Kinda Funny Games Cast days. And I remember hearing all of these guests and people just keep bringing it up in passing and talking about it here and there, like, oh, Silent Hill 2's narrative, oh, it's so adult, oh, it was so mature for the time, oh, I feel like we haven't seen many games since then really tackle themes like that. And so as someone who wasn't alive when the original came out, I've always been curious, what made that game so special? And honestly, I never really had any idea. I never knew anything about the game. And somehow, over the course of my time on the internet, I've managed to be like one of the 5 people who's never had this game spoiled for them. Now, I've gone back a few times and tried to play the original Silent Hill 2, but honestly, it's just too dated for me to get behind. And the fixed camera angles and the weird combat and the bad voice acting all just made it super hard for me to get into and appreciate what it was going for as a survival horror game. Because honestly, the only thing I was really scared of when I was playing that game was the control scheme. However, that doesn't diminish how good and beloved that game is. It's still talked about all the time to this day. And that's why, when it was originally announced that a remake of this game was coming, people were really excited. But then they saw a trailer of the game and they weren't very excited. People were worried that Bloober Team, the team behind Layers of Fear and the Blair Witch game, yikes, and The Medium were going to butcher this remake. And with each passing trailer and each time we got closer to the game, it just seemed worse and worse. Now, me personally, I wasn't too worried because all of the Bloober Team games I've played, which is just Layers of Fear, I've really enjoyed. I was thoroughly scared by those games and I thought they were awesome. But I know that the Blair Witch game was totally panned and I know that The Medium was very mixed. People just weren't sure if Bloober Team was ready to tackle a story with the themes as deep and dark as they are in Silent Hill 2. And I think that's totally fair if you look at the work they did on The Medium, which again, I didn't play personally, but I'm pretty familiar with how that game ticks. I can see how people were concerned, especially after seeing the trailer. However, I still held out faith because I was hoping that it would just at the very least give me a window into this narrative that I can at least play through in a modern way and enjoy. And honestly, I couldn't have been more right. So let's talk about the actual game itself. Let's start with the good, and then we'll get into the bad, and then we'll get into the excellent. So the good. First thing I want to talk about in this section is the world. I mean, dude, the world in this game is unreal. Every single environment you walk through is beautifully crafted and presented in a way that is just almost immaculate. I mean, some of these environments are some of the best survival horror environments I've ever seen, and they rival the ones you'll see in Resident Evil 2 Remake, Resident Evil 4 Remake, and Alan Wake 2. Each environment you go through in this game just has such personality and such distinct elements to it, and it's all presented with beautiful lumen ray tracing and beautiful graphical and audio presentation that really makes it feel lived in, authentic, real, and as disgusting as it's supposed to. A particular highlight for me was the Toluca prison. There were some things about this area gameplay-wise that I didn't love that I'll go into later, but the environments themselves and the way you go through them and how you progress through the floors and all the different rooms are incredibly disturbing, and I loved it. Now, good environments mean nothing without interesting things to do in those environments. So, how are the puzzles and combat in this game? Well, let's start with the puzzles. The puzzles are awesome. I heard a lot of people giving the puzzles in this game a lot of shit. And to be fair, I understand it. If you're somebody that doesn't play survival horror games for the puzzles and the puzzles aren't your favorite part and you get stuck on them or you just don't like them, this game's probably not for you. I'm gonna be so for real because there are a lot of puzzles. Some of them are very obligatory and clearly just there to burn some time, which I didn't mind because I enjoy doing puzzles and I enjoy that sort of thing. But if you don't, you might get annoyed and bored very quickly. But for me personally, these were some of my favorite survival horror puzzles ever. Now, there's 2 puzzles in particular I want to highlight just to give people that do know the game a sense of what puzzles I loved and why I loved them so much. So the first one is a puzzle in the hospital. It's in the second section of the hospital. If you've played the game, you know what I'm talking about. And basically, it involves you figuring out a bunch of different codes to unlock a chest in the middle of a room. And you have to keep going around the hospital to find out information. And there's an x-ray thing involved. And it's like a 2-hour long puzzle. And I can see how it would annoy some some people, because I was watching Moist Critical and he talked about how some of the puzzles felt fetch questy, and I can totally see what he means by that, and I can get how that would be off-putting to people. It's a lot of running around through different rooms and taking different paths and shortcuts to different places to just get one little piece of information that helps you progress through a puzzle. Now, I get why that's annoying. I totally do, and I don't begrudge people for feeling that way, but for me, I loved it. I love sleuthy shit like that, and just playing as James Sunderland going through these environments being like, whoa, and just like all these cringy ass voice lines while you're just, you know, fighting these monsters and just trying to get the codes to these puzzles and these locks, I thought was awesome. Couldn't have had more fun. Now, a more inventive puzzle and a clearly, pretty much objectively better puzzle that comes later in the game in the Toluca prison is one that involves you, how do I put this? It involves you putting these stanzas of a poem together. So basically there's like 4 like stanzas of a poem, and there's little slots where you can put other stanzas of a poem, and you have to read the first stanzas of each of these poems and then read the second stanzas that are all randomly assorted, and you have to match the second stanza to the first stanza. And I just loved that as somebody who's a theater major who loves poetry and loves writing and just loves wordplay and connecting things. And I also play the NYT games every day. It just really scratched a brain itch for me. And I loved that I got to do that in an experience I already loved for a variety of other reasons, that I got to partake in puzzles that I also really loved. So honestly, the puzzles here are a massive highlight for me. Moving on from the puzzles, there was also the narrative. The narrative in this game is unbelievably good. Trust me, I know you've heard it all before, but I really want to give my take on it, because as someone that has, how do I put this without spoilers? I'll get more into this in the spoiler section, but there's certain ways in which I can relate to this story uniquely that not everyone can, that made it incredibly depressing for me, but also incredibly engaging and incredibly real feeling. And honestly, I just adored it for that. And I want to get more into it, but I genuinely cannot say more without spoiling it. And that sort of leads me into the bad section of this review. And so let's continue talking about the narrative in that sense. This narrative does not start off good. The first 4 hours of this game, in fact, are quite rough, and you don't get any connection to these characters or the world or the narrative or any information regarding those things until after you get past the Woodside Apartments, which is probably about 4 to 5 hours into the game, depending on how efficient of a gamer you are. And I think that's a major problem. I would not be surprised if a lot of people just dip out of this game after that section of the game, just because they're like, okay, I have no connection to this world, no connection to these characters, and I don't care what's happening, and all of these puzzles are fetch questy, and it's just really a rough intro to the game, and I wish they had fixed that. Now, I've heard the original Silent Hill 2 also has a similar problem, where the first 4 hours are not so good, and I don't think that's an excuse. I don't think you can use that as an excuse to say, well, the original game was like that, so of course the remake's going to be like that. You're making a remake for a reason, right? You're trying to fix the problems that the original game had. And so I think it's really unfortunate that Bloober Team wasn't able to fix those first couple hours, because it is really rough. I enjoyed it okay. Some of the puzzles were a little eye-rolly. There were definitely a few times where it was like, okay, now you got to go up to the 3rd floor and get a key up there to open a stairwell on the 2nd floor to go all the way down to the basement to get this thing, and then go all the way back up here to get this thing, just to get this one of 5 pieces that you need to solve the main puzzle. And it was really annoying, and I definitely let out a few sighs of like, and even if someone who loves puzzles, loves survival horror, and loves narrative is ready to give up on this game, which I low-key was. Like about 3 hours into the game, I was like, am I going to finish this, or should I just go play Metaphor ReFantasio? But I stuck it through, and I'm so happy I did. But I think on the other hand, there's a lot of people that aren't going to stick it through, especially people like, I know my cousin Spencer, I give him shout outs a lot because he's like the closest person in my life I have that likes video games the way I do. And he was talking to me about how like, he's like, yeah, I played the first hour. I got to like, he basically got to the Woodside Apartments area. And he was just like, yeah, I don't know if I'll get back to it because Metaphor's coming out and I'd rather play that. And it wasn't, he didn't say this, but I got the vibe that it wasn't super clicking with him, especially since he's already had the narrative spoiled for him. So it's just like, it's unfortunate, but I think a lot of people are just going to feel that same way of like, there's so many games to play. I'll just dip out and I'll do something else. And I totally understand that, you know, you can only give a game so much time, especially now. And as you get older and you have kids, or you have a job and you have other, life responsibilities. You can't, as you develop other life responsibilities, you can only give a video game so much time to hook you, And so I get that and I respect it and I understand it, but it's just a shame. And I wish Bloober Team had done something. I don't know what they could do while still maintaining the spirit and core of the original game, which is like supposed to hold its cards very close to its chest regarding its narrative. I think what you'd have to do is fix the gameplay in some way and make it more engaging. And I think they should have made that section faster, and they should have gotten into the meat of the narrative just a little bit quicker. I'm telling you, if it was just like an hour shorter, if that Woodside apartment section is just 1 hour shorter, and then you can get into the meat and bones of the narrative. Once you meet Maria, which is right after the Woodside apartments, the game really picks up. You start to be like, whoa, what's happening here? Why is this happening? Who are these people? What's going on? And you start to pick up on the allegories that the narrative is going for, and you start to pick up on what's happening just a little bit more. Again, it's not a lot. You really don't fully understand the narrative until the very end. However, you get a little bit more. Like you get like 20% more, and that 20% goes a long way towards keeping you engaged. And I really wish they had gotten to that point sooner, because that is just an inexcusable problem for me. Like, honestly, when it takes 4 hours for you to get into the meat of this game and what's happening, and to get into enjoyable, interesting gameplay and narrative things, that's a problem. That's a real problem. The last thing I want to talk about in this bad section of the review is the scares. Now, I'm not somebody who usually gets super scared at survival horror games. There are exceptions for sure. Resident Evil 7 had me almost shit my pants a few times. That game was horrific and horrifying in so many ways. But most of the horror games I play, like Resident Evil 2 wasn't that scary, and Alan Wake 2 wasn't that scary. This game is extra not scary. I hear I'm alone in this. Like I saw a lot of reviews from IGN and GameSpot praising how horrifying this game is. And I get where they're coming from, but for me, the first half of this game is super not scary. And the reason for that is the enemy types. So there's a lack of variety in these enemy types, and there is a narrative reason for that. And I don't fault the game for that. And honestly, I think it's cool how few there are. But the problem is their move sets and their attack sets are the exact same every time you fight them. See, it's one thing to only have a few enemy types, right? But it's a totally other thing to only have a few enemy types and they do the exact same predictable thing every time. Because once I got to the hospital and I'm fighting the same enemy types I've been fighting all game, with one new one thrown in, to be fair, but it's very similar to another one you fought before. And the hospital section is probably the longest section in the game. So once you get there and you're fighting these enemies, I could take out all of these enemies with just my melee weapon. So I wasn't scared of these enemies at all, because I knew if an enemy hopped out around a corner, it's like, well, I just have to time this dodge correctly, and then I can just hit him with my pipe a bunch and conserve ammo for a boss fight. And I don't think that's how survival horror games should work. Like in Resident Evil 2 Remake, every time you see a zombie, sure, they look the same and they do similar things, but that zombie is going to come at you in a slightly different way every time. That makes it really hard for you to predict your dodge and makes it really hard. I mean, I'm sure people that are really good can time it perfectly every time, but on a first playthrough, it's really hard to predict these enemies. Whereas in Silent Hill 2, if you just play the game like it's I don't know, if you play it like it's Bloodborne and you just try and dodge, hit, dodge, you know what I mean? If you play a Souls game, if you've played Souls games, you can easily figure out how to game this system, and it makes the enemies considerably less scary. It feels almost like a rhythm game of just dodge, hit, dodge, hit, dodge, hit, and you get into like a kind of a groove, you know what I'm saying? It's actually kind of fun, to be honest, but it's not scary, and that's an issue for me. I will say this does improve as the game goes on, particularly in the Toluca prison section. They introduce a new enemy type that is fucking horrifying, and throughout that entire section, there's a gameplay mechanic there too with light switches, and that's all I'm going to say. I'm not going to spoil anything else, but it is one of the scariest sections of a survival horror game I've ever played. So the scares aren't all bad, and there are scares to be found here, but I find that they're incredibly loaded into the second half. The first half, I wasn't scared at all. The second half, I had some very tense, scary moments, and I loved it. And I wish that that stuff was more in the first half of the game. Again, we're getting back to the game starts really slow. And it's like, not really slow in like a slow burn way. It's like really slow in like a why the fuck am I playing this way, until you get to the hospital and you get through the hospital and then you're like, oh, I see what's happening here. And then it just barrels through to the end and it's amazing the whole way through. I know this video has had a consistent theme of the game starts off slow, and I really harped on that in the last section, but I want to give the game its flowers now. Let's talk about the excellence of this game. So despite its slow start, which again, I've gone over, it's not excusable and it's not okay, and I don't like it. The last 4 hours in this game are some of the best I've ever experienced in a video game. And I mean that. And I know I say that about survival horror games a lot. And part of it's just because I love this genre so much, but genuinely, the last 4 hours of this game are unbelievable on a narrative level, on a gameplay level. Just the things that are happening and the way it's presenting itself to you is insane. And it dives into themes that are just unbelievable for a video game to tackle, especially one from 2002, man. I cannot believe this game came out in 2002. Like, I can't. Like, not like the, one I'm playing now, but I can't believe this narrative was originally presented to players back in 2002. It's so much more mature and deep and interesting than 99% of narratives that you see in AAA games today. Like, if you take Silent Hill 2 from 2002 in the narrative and compare it to something like Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League, it is crazy how despite 22 years of technical advancements and narrative advancements and advancements in just every aspect of the art form, how Silent Hill 2 still just absolutely clobbers it in every single way. And granted, I'm comparing apples to oranges a little bit, but it's just to put into perspective how ahead of its time that narrative is. Even compared to a narrative like Alan Wake 2, I think Silent Hill 2 really holds its own, man. And I'm going to get into that a little bit more now, so I'm going to start spoiling things. So this is your spoiler warning. If you want no spoilers at all, then you should probably just skip to the section linked in the, the YouTube bar. There'll be a little thing on the bar that says conclusion or something like that. Just skip to that part because that part won't have spoilers. Anyway, thank you. You've been excused. So, spoiler-wise, I think the easiest way to discuss the spoilers here would be to go back to when I said there are certain elements of this narrative that I can relate to on a level that a lot of people can't. And so let's talk about that. So when you get towards the end of this game, you find out James Sunderland's wife didn't die 3 years ago. She got diagnosed with a chronic illness that's killing her 3 years ago. And throughout that time, James grew resentful of her, and she died because he killed her and suffocated her with a pillow. And there's this awesome fucking scene where he's like talking to a version of her that's obviously not real. And she says, it's okay. It's okay. I understand why you did it. You wanted to put me out of my misery. I'm happier now. Something I'm paraphrasing, but something along those lines. And he says, I didn't do it because of that. I did it because I hate you. And when that line came up, dude, I was sitting in my room and I paused the game and I just looked up at the ceiling and genuinely, I was just like, fuck, man. Like, what? What, a video game is doing this? Like a video game from 2002, a narrative in a video game from 2002 is doing this, and I didn't know. I am like disappointed in myself that me, the narrative guy, the guy who loves narrative in interactive mediums, didn't know that. And didn't really understand how ahead of its time this narrative was. The main reason for this is, and the reason I say it's so ahead of its time, is think about how complex and deep of an emotion that is to express. The resentment of someone you once loved because they have a chronic illness that they can't control, that's killing them. And you resent them so much that you kill them. Think about how deep of an emotion that is, how dark and twisted of an emotion that is, but it's not uncommon. If you know anyone in your life that has had something like terminal cancer for a long time, I am sure you've seen the toll that takes on the people around them. And no one wants to talk about it because of a variety of reasons, because it is kind of fucked up to talk about, wow, your cancer is really hurting me, right? Obviously, that's not something you want to express ever. And the fact that a video game was able to tackle that concept with respect to how tragic it is just unbelievable, man. And the whole last 4 hours building up to it, and the whole Angela storyline and the Eddie storyline, and you realize that they're also just people who have done these horrible things and are trying to reckon with it, and they had their reasons, right? And it totally makes sense, and you see why these people were driven to this point. But it doesn't excuse what they did. And Silent Hill 2 is not trying to do that. It's not trying to say these people are good. It's trying to say these are people who are flawed. These are real people. These are people who were driven to this point of doing these terrible things by these terrible circumstances that were dealt to them. And I just think that's such an adult conversation to have. And it's one that's really hard to have with a level of respect for the people that they have hurt. You know, it's just such a good reminder that life isn't so black and white. It's not as cut and dry as oh, I'm going to love you unconditionally no matter what. And I am someone who has a chronic illness, and I also have a life partner, right? Now, my chronic illness is not terminal, so that's good, so I haven't had to deal with something to quite the extent that, James and Mary had to deal with. But it's just like, I can relate to the feeling of my illness putting my partner into uncomfortable situations or situations where they might resent me. And that sucks. That's a shitty feeling. And I think that Mary's side of this equation is explored beautifully throughout this game. Like, you really get to understand how Mary felt, especially in the Leave ending, which is the ending I got, which is the good ending. That letter that she reads as Laura and James are driving away from the town, the letter that she's reading is just so deeply sad and personal, and I could honestly relate to it on many levels. Again, a smaller scale, but I could still relate to it on many levels, and it was just harrowing and heartbreaking and just beautiful, man. Like, this is why I do this shit. This is why I make YouTube videos. This is why I talk about video games, because video games have the ability to express these things in ways that no other medium can. They put you in the shoes of this guy for 12 hours. And it's the reason I stand up for The Last of Us 2's narrative, even though people shit on it all the time, is the beauty of video games is being able to put you in the shoes of somebody. You're able to fully understand what they had to go through and how they feel. And throughout Silent Hill 2, you get to understand the guilt and shame that James feels for feeling resentful, even though it's not shocking. If someone you love is dying, of course you're going to feel somewhat resentful. And that's not something to be ashamed of. It is something to fight, and it is a feeling to remind yourself is not a good first reaction, but it's not something to feel shameful over. What he should feel shame for is how he dealt with that feeling. He dealt with that feeling by ignoring her, by avoiding her, and then by ultimately killing her. That's disgusting, and that's terrible, right? But the feeling itself is not something to feel shame for. But he was driven to do these things because of the shame he felt, and it's just... man, it's really something. And the way that this game expresses these points is just beautiful. And I don't know how much of that is Bloober Team and how much of that is the original narrative, but the coalescence of these two, the original's narrative with the presentation of this game, is just immaculate, man. And those last 4 hours really tie together. So, final takeaways. As I've said throughout the course of this video, those first few hours are tough and they are inexcusable. And honestly, I am very upset that those first 4 hours exist, because if they didn't, this game would be an easy 4 out of 4 for me. The last 8 hours, and particularly the last 4, are just video games at their ultimate peak of just narrative and expression of emotion and gameplay and using everything at their disposal to make you feel something. And so it's really hard for me to not want to give this game a 4 out of 4, But again, I can't excuse those first 4 hours because they are really slow and really rough, and a lot of people won't get to experience the excellence of those last 8 hours because they gave up on the first 4, and that makes me really sad. Now, a counter to this might be, well, it was like that in the original game, but I don't buy it. It's Bloober's job to make those first 4 hours more interesting and to get more people to the guts and the meat of this game that are in the last 4 hours. And so those first 4 hours are just really rough, and I just can't excuse it. And I'm sorry, but I just can't. However, in spite of that, the last 4 hours are so excellent, and the boss fights are so unbelievable, and the turns this story takes are just so incredible that I still am positive that this game is going to end up somewhere near the top at my top 10 list at the end of the year. It's going to be somewhere in that top 5 range. And that's because, and it's a testament really, to how perfect this narrative ties together. And I really hesitate to use that word, but everything, even those first 4 hours that are rough, is made worth it by the end, in my opinion. So overall, I'm going to give this game a strong 3 out of 4. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. Do I wish there was more variety, particularly in the first half of the game? Absolutely. But the ending is so strong, and I feel so passionately about how well the themes of this narrative are explored and expanded upon, that I could not give it anything less than a 3 out of 4. And it's honestly, even with those first 4 hours, it's verging on a 4. That's why I say it's a strong 3. It's an excellent video game, and I recommend it to anyone who's a fan of the survival horror genre, especially if you enjoy the puzzles, not only deal with them, but enjoy them. This is a game you have to play. And narrative, too, if you're someone who really appreciates a good narrative in video games, you have to play it. So yeah, that's my opinion on Silent Hill 2 Remake. I highly recommend it. If you're someone who doesn't like survival horror or doesn't like puzzles in video games, then I think you should probably avoid it. But I still recommend experiencing the narrative in some way, because the narrative is just immaculate. Like it's a really once in a generation narrative. It's up there with Alan Wake 2 and the original The Last of Us and just other games that are just true tent poles in narrative design in video games. Obra Dinn, you know, these games, it's up there with those just relentlessly good narratives. And so if you're someone who really appreciates stuff like that, I think you should find a way to experience it. Anyway, that's my take. And yeah, thanks for watching. My next video, I'm not sure when it will be, and I'm not sure what it'll be on, honestly. I'm working through Metaphor ReFantasia right now, but I mean, school and a bunch of other things, it's just really hard to get through an 80-hour game. I definitely plan on covering it at some point. I don't know when I'll get to it, when I'll finally be done with it. And I'm definitely going to cover Dragon Age the Veilguard as well. So whichever one of those I end up finishing first, maybe Black Ops 6 I'll talk about. We'll see. Anyway, this is a new format of review for me, a little bit more off the cuff. I went more with bullet points than scripting, so let me know what you think of it down below. Do you prefer this style, or do you prefer the scripted styles of my older reviews? Let me know. I'm curious to hear what you think. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you guys next time. Peace!